July 7th, 1968. Harlem's streets were quiet that morning, but behind the doors, a storm was about to erupt. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, Harlem's most powerful black gangster, had died of a heart attack at 62. Known as the man who kept the streets under control, respected by both the community and the Italian Mafia, Bumpy's passing left a vacuum in Harlem, a throne that everyone wanted. The news spread like wildfire through the tenements, the jazz clubs, the corner stores. From 110th Street to 155th, people whispered the same question. What happens now? Because Bumpy wasn't just a gangster. He was a protector, a strategist, a legend who had turned Harlem's numbers racket into an empire while keeping the neighborhood safe from the worst kinds of violence. He had deals with the Italian Mafia that kept the peace. He had respect from politicians who knew better than to cross him. And he had the love of everyday people who saw him as one of their own. But now he was gone. And in that power vacuum, everyone saw opportunity. The Italian families, the Irish gangs, the young black gangsters rising up with ambition and hunger. Everyone wanted a piece of what Bumpy had built. Among the mourners, one man wasn't just grieving. Frank Lucas, Bumpy's trusted driver and right-hand man, understood something others didn't. Harlem's underworld was about to decide who would rule next. And Frank had a plan that would make him unforgettable. The Abyssinian Baptist Church on West 138th Street had never seen a funeral like this. It was July 10th, 3 days after Bumpy's death, and the church was packed beyond capacity. People spilled out onto the sidewalk, craning their necks to catch a glimpse inside. The summer heat was oppressive, but nobody left. This was history. Inside, the pews told the story of Bumpy Johnson's influence. In the front rows sat Harlem's elite. Politicians who owed their elections to Bumpy's support. Community leaders who had worked with him to keep the neighborhood stable. Preachers who had accepted his donations even while preaching against the sins he profited from. Behind them, the gangsters. On the left side, members of the Italian Mafia sat in dark suits, their faces impassive but watchful. These were men from the Genovese and Lucchese families, the ones who had worked with Bumpy for decades, splitting territories and profits with a handshake and mutual respect. They came not just to pay respects, but to assess, to see who would step up, to determine if they could maintain their arrangement or if they'd need to take more direct control of Harlem. On the right side, the black gangsters, younger men, hungry men. Nicky Barnes was there, dressed impeccably as always, his eyes scanning the room like a predator. He'd been rising fast in Harlem's heroin trade, and everyone knew he saw himself as the heir apparent. There were others too. Street bosses, numbers runners, enforcers. All of them calculating their next move, and scattered throughout, ordinary people. The shopkeepers Bumpy had protected, the families he'd helped when times were hard, the elderly women who remembered when he'd chased the worst criminals out of the neighborhood. They were there because they genuinely mourned the man who, despite his criminal empire, had been a pillar of their community. The organ played. The choir sang. Reverend Dr. Samuel D. Proctor delivered the eulogy, speaking carefully about Bumpy's complexity and his love for Harlem. Everyone understood what wasn't being said directly. And through it all, Frank Lucas sat quietly in the third row. He was 38 years old, lean and composed, wearing a dark suit that was expensive but not flashy. To most people in that church, Frank was nobody special. Bumpy's driver, a loyal employee, a man who carried bags and opened doors. But Frank was watching everything. He watched the Italian mobsters whisper to each other, already discussing territory. He watched Nicky Barnes' glad-hand mourners, positioning himself as the natural successor. He watched the politicians distance themselves now that their protector was gone. He watched the community leaders worry about what would happen to their neighborhood. And Frank understood something that would change everything. The game was about to restart, and everyone was making the same mistake. They were all moving too fast, too loud, too obvious. Bumpy had taught Frank better than that. See, for the past 15 years, Frank Lucas had been learning. While others saw him as just a driver, Frank had been Bumpy's student. He'd sat in the back of the car while Bumpy conducted meetings. He'd stood quietly in the corner while Bumpy negotiated with the Italians. He'd watched Bumpy settle disputes, build alliances, and maintain power not through violence, but through strategy. Bumpy had taught him, the loudest man in the room is the weakest man in the room. Bumpy had taught him, if you're going to be successful in this life, you have to be disciplined. Bumpy had taught him, don't trust nobody but your own blood. And most importantly, Bumpy had taught him, be invisible. The longer you stay invisible, the longer you can stay in power. As the funeral ended and people filed out into the Harlem heat, Frank Lucas didn't rush. He didn't make announcements. He didn't try to assert dominance or claim territory. He simply paid his respects, shook hands with those who mattered, and disappeared into the crowd. Because Frank understood what others didn't. The power vacuum wasn't an invitation to make noise. It was an opportunity for someone patient enough, smart enough, and disciplined enough to fill it quietly. The question wasn't who would claim Bumpy's throne the loudest. The question was who had learned Bumpy's lessons well enough to claim it the right way. And Frank Lucas had been preparing for this moment for 15 years. To understand Frank Lucas's rise, you have to understand who Bumpy Johnson really was. Ellsworth Raymond. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just another gangster. He was an institution. Born in 1905 in Charleston, South Carolina, Bumpy came to Harlem during the Great Migration, like thousands of other Black Americans seeking better opportunities in the North. But Harlem in the 1920s and 30s wasn't the promised land. It was overcrowded, impoverished, and controlled by white mobsters who saw Black neighborhoods as territory to exploit. Bumpy rose through the ranks during the Harlem Renaissance era, working his way up through the numbers racket, an illegal lottery that was hugely popular in Black communities. While white gangsters like Dutch Schultz tried to muscle in on Harlem, Bumpy fought back. He became known as the man who would stand up to anyone, Black or white, who tried to exploit his community. By the 1950s and 60s, Bumpy had achieved something remarkable. He controlled Harlem's numbers operation and had negotiated a partnership with the Italian Mafia families. Think about what that meant. This was the era of segregation, the era when Black Americans were still fighting for basic civil rights. And yet, Bumpy Johnson sat down with Italian mob bosses as an equal. They respected him because he was smart, disciplined, and powerful enough to hurt them if they didn't. The arrangement was simple. Bumpy controlled Harlem. The Italians got a percentage, and everyone made money. More importantly, this arrangement kept the peace. It kept Harlem from becoming a war zone. But Bumpy was more than just a criminal entrepreneur. He was strategic. When other gangsters would solve problems with violence, Bumpy would use negotiation. He understood that the goal wasn't just to win today's battle. It was to build something that would last. He was connected. Bumpy knew politicians, police officers, judges, lawyers. He understood that in America, power wasn't just about muscle. It was about relationships and influence. he was a protector. Yes, Bumpy profited from illegal gambling and other vices. But he also kept the worst elements out of Harlem. He stopped violent criminals from preying on the community. He helped families in need. He funded local businesses. Then in his own way, he was a pillar of the neighborhood. And most importantly, for our story, Bumpy was a teacher. Frank Lucas met Bumpy Johnson in 1953, when Frank was just 23 years old and fresh up from North Carolina. Frank had already had his share of trouble down south. He'd assaulted a man who'd hurt his family and had to flee. But in Harlem, he was nobody. Bumpy saw something in the young man. Maybe it was Frank's intelligence. Maybe it was his ambition. Maybe it was his willingness to learn. Whatever it was, Bumpy took Frank under his wing. For 15 years, Frank Lucas was Bumpy Johnson's shadow. He started as a driver, but that role gave him access to everything. Frank would pick up Bumpy early in the morning and wouldn't drop him off until late at night. In between, he witnessed every meeting, every negotiation, every decision. Bumpy didn't just employ Frank, he educated him. He taught Frank about the economics of the street, how to price products, how to manage territory, how to handle money. He taught Frank about psychology, how to read people, how to build loyalty, how to make allies out of potential enemies. He taught Frank about patience, how waiting for the right moment was more powerful than acting impulsively. He taught Frank about invisibility, how the flashiest gangster usually ended up dead or in prison first. And perhaps most importantly, Bumpy taught Frank about respect, real respect. Not the fear-based respect that came from violence, but the earned respect that came from being reliable, intelligent, and true to your word. Frank absorbed it all like a sponge. While other young gangsters in Harlem were trying to make names for themselves, getting into shootouts and attracting police attention, Frank Lucas stayed quiet. He worked, he watched, he learned, he saved his money, he built relationships, he prepared. And then, on July 7th, 1968, his teacher died. The state of Harlem's underworld was suddenly chaotic. The Italian Mafia families immediately started positioning themselves to take more direct control. They'd given Bumpy autonomy because he was Bumpy, but they saw the younger black gangsters as potential partners or potential problems, not equals. Nicky Barnes and other rising black gangsters saw an opportunity to fill the vacuum. They had ambition, they had street soldiers, they had connections to heroin suppliers. What they didn't have was Bumpy's strategic mind or his relationships. The police and politicians saw an opportunity to clean up Harlem, or at least appear to be cleaning it up. With Bumpy gone, they could crack down without worrying about political backlash from a powerful community figure. And the community itself was worried. Bumpy had been a stabilizing force. Without him, would Harlem descend into violence? Would outside gangs take over? Would the neighborhood tear itself apart? In all of this chaos, Frank Lucas was underestimated. He was seen as Bumpy's driver, a loyal employee, sure, but not a boss, not a strategist, not someone who could fill Bumpy Johnson's shoes. That underestimation was Frank's greatest advantage. Because while everyone else was scrambling, Frank was implementing everything Bumpy had taught him. And he was about to show Harlem that he'd been the best student Bumpy Johnson ever had. In the weeks and months after Bumpy's funeral, Harlem's underworld was like a chessboard where everyone was making their opening moves. And Frank Lucas played it perfectly. His first move was the hardest one. He did nothing. While Nicky Barnes was publicly positioning himself as Harlem's new power player, while the Italian families were sending representatives to renegotiate territories, while young gangsters were getting into territorial disputes, Frank Lucas stayed quiet. He didn't make claims. He didn't pick fights. He didn't try to publicly assert dominance. This confused people. Some saw it as weakness. Some thought Frank was grieving and out of the game. Some simply forgot about him. That was exactly what Frank wanted. See, Frank understood something fundamental. In the immediate aftermath of Bumpy's death, everyone was watching everyone else. The police were paying attention. The Italian Mafia was assessing threats. The other gangsters were looking for rivals to eliminate early. This was the worst possible time to make yourself visible. So Frank went about his business quietly. He maintained the relationships Bumpy had built. He kept in touch with the numbers runners, the local business owners, the community figures who had worked with Bumpy. He was respectful, helpful, and most importantly, reliable. He also did something smart. He started building his own team, but not from the flashy, ambitious young gangsters everyone was recruiting. Frank recruited family, his brothers, people from back home in North Carolina who were loyal to him personally, not to the game. Bumpy had taught him, don't trust nobody but your own blood. Frank took that lesson to heart. He built a small, tight organization of people he could absolutely trust. They weren't the best at violence or intimidation. The Barnes crew had them beat there. But they were disciplined and loyal. And Frank had another advantage: money. While other gangsters had spent their earnings on cars, jewelry, clothes, and women, Frank had been saving for 15 years. He'd learned from Bumpy to live below his means, to avoid flashy displays that attracted attention. Frank had a substantial amount of cash saved up, not the mythical 100K legend, but enough to invest in his next move. Because Frank was analyzing the heroin game, and he saw a problem everyone else was accepting as normal. In the late 1960s, heroin in Harlem came through a long supply chain. It started in Southeast Asia, Turkey, Thailand, Vietnam, where opium poppies were grown and processed. From there, it went to European middlemen, usually in Marseille, France, who refined it further. Then it came to Italian Mafia families in the United States, who distributed it to black gangsters in places like Harlem, who then sold it on the streets. Each step of that chain meant the product got more expensive and less pure. By the time heroin hit Harlem, it might be only 5 to 10% pure, cut with quinine, sugar, powdered milk, anything to stretch the product. And at each step, someone was taking a cut of the profits. The black gangsters in Harlem were at the end of that chain. They were paying the highest prices for the lowest quality product, and they had no leverage over their suppliers. Frank saw this as inefficient. Bumpy had taught him to think like a businessman, not just a criminal. And as a businessman, Frank saw an obvious solution: cut out the middlemen. But this wasn't going to be easy. The Italian Mafia controlled the heroin trade in America. They had the connections to the European suppliers. They had the infrastructure to import and distribute. They weren't going to let some black gangster from Harlem just bypass them. Frank needed to think differently. And in 1968, he had an advantage: the Vietnam War. American soldiers were in Southeast Asia. There were U.S. military bases in Thailand and South Vietnam. There were cargo planes flying back and forth between Asia and the United States every single day. And there was a massive opium and heroin trade happening right there in the Golden Triangle region, where Thailand, Laos, and Burma met. Frank started putting together a plan that was audacious, dangerous, and potentially revolutionary. He would go directly to the source. He would travel to Southeast Asia, meet with suppliers in Thailand, and arrange to have heroin shipped directly to the United States using military connections, either through corrupt soldiers or by hiding product in cargo returning from Vietnam. This had never been done before by a black gangster. The Italian Mafia had their European roots locked down, but they didn't have connections in Southeast Asia. They didn't have people who could navigate the chaos of the Vietnam War era. Frank did his research quietly. He reached out to contacts who had served in Vietnam. He learned about the logistics of military transport. He identified potential partners in Southeast Asia. And in 1969, roughly a year after Bumpy's death, Frank Lucas made his first trip to Bangkok, Thailand. The trip was a gamble. He was leaving his organization back in Harlem without its leader. He was going to a foreign country where he didn't speak the language and had no real connections. He was approaching Asian drug suppliers who had no reason to trust an American black man. But Frank had learned from Bumpy. Sometimes you have to take calculated risks. In Bangkok, Frank navigated the complex world of Southeast Asian heroin production. He met with suppliers, negotiated prices, and established relationships. He learned about the different grades of heroin, the purity levels, the production methods, and he made a deal. He would buy heroin directly from Thai suppliers at a fraction of what he'd been paying Italian middlemen. The product would be nearly pure, maybe 98% pure compared to the 5 to 10% pure heroin on Harlem streets. And he would arrange to have it shipped to the United States through channels connected to the military supply chain. The details of exactly how Frank transported the heroin became the stuff of legend. The most famous story, which Frank himself told but which others disputed, was that he hid heroin in the caskets of dead American soldiers being returned from Vietnam. Whether that specific method was true or not, what's certain is that Frank found a way to import heroin from Southeast Asia directly, and that changed everything. He called his product Blue Magic. The name was brilliant marketing. It sounded mysterious. It sounded powerful. And most importantly, it distinguished his product from every other heroin on the streets. Blue Magic was different. It was purer. It was cheaper. And because Frank controlled the entire supply chain from Thailand to Harlem, his profit margins were enormous. But Frank didn't flood the market immediately. He didn't advertise. He didn't brag. He started small. He distributed Blue Magic through his tight network of family members and trusted associates. He kept prices lower than the competition, but not so low that it seemed suspicious. He built a reputation for reliability and quality. And slowly, quietly, Blue Magic started to take over. Heroin users in Harlem noticed the difference. This wasn't the weak, cut product they were used to. This was pure. This was powerful. This was what they'd been looking for. Other dealers noticed too. They started losing customers to whoever was selling Blue Magic. They started asking questions. Who was behind this? Where was it coming from? The Italian Mafia noticed. Their heroin business in Harlem was being undercut. They were losing money. They needed to find out who was disrupting their operation. But here's where Frank's discipline paid off. He stayed invisible. He didn't drive fancy cars. He didn't wear flashy jewelry. He didn't move to a mansion or start living large where everyone could see. He lived modestly. He dressed conservatively. He avoided the clubs and parties where other gangsters showed off. When people asked who was behind Blue Magic, they couldn't figure it out. There was no obvious kingpin, no flashy boss throwing money around. Just a very efficient distribution network that seemed to operate like a legitimate business. By 1970, just 2 years after Bumpy's death, Frank Lucas had quietly become one of the most powerful drug dealers in Harlem. But almost nobody knew it. And that was exactly how Frank wanted it. Of course, you can't build an empire without attracting attention eventually. By 1971, Frank Lucas's Blue Magic had become the dominant heroin brand in Harlem. And the people who'd initially underestimated him were starting to realize their mistake. Nicky Barnes was the first to take notice. Barnes was flashy in all the ways Frank wasn't. He drove expensive cars, wore custom suits, frequented the hottest clubs. He called himself Mr. Untouchable and had built a reputation as Harlem's most prominent drug dealer. He even appeared on the cover of the New York Times magazine. Barnes had assumed after Bumpy's death that he was the heir apparent to Harlem's criminal underworld. And for a while, it seemed like he was right. But then this Blue Magic started cutting into his business. His dealers were complaining, his customers were going elsewhere, his profits were dropping. At first, Barnes didn't know who to blame, but eventually, the word got back to him. Frank Lucas, Bumpy's old driver. This was almost insulting to Barnes. Frank was supposed to be nobody, a has-been, a functionary from the old era. Barnes sent people to talk to Frank. At first, the conversations were respectful. Professional courtesy between two Harlem businessmen. Barnes suggested they could work together, divide territory, avoid conflict. But Frank had learned from Bumpy. Never show weakness, but also never pick unnecessary fights. Frank's response was brilliant. He didn't refuse Barnes outright, which would have started a war. But he also didn't agree to give up any significant territory or profit. Instead, he proposed mutually beneficial arrangements. Frank would sell to certain corners, Barnes to others. They'd avoid each other's territories. They'd maintain respect. What Frank was really doing was buying time and avoiding conflict while he consolidated his power. Because Frank understood something about Barnes. For all his flash and ambition, Nicky Barnes was already making a crucial mistake. He was too visible. He was attracting too much law enforcement attention. The New York Times magazine cover might have fed his ego, but it was also putting a target on his back. Frank, meanwhile, was still invisible. The Italian Mafia families were a different challenge. The Genovese and Lucchese families had worked with Bumpy Johnson for decades. They'd gotten used to their arrangement. They supplied heroin to Harlem. They took their percentage. Everyone made money. But now, their Harlem profits were dropping because of this Blue Magic product. And when they investigated, they discovered something that genuinely concerned them. Someone had found a way to import heroin that bypassed the Italian-controlled European supply chain. This was potentially devastating to their entire business model. Representatives from the families reached out to Frank. Unlike with Nicky Barnes, these conversations were more serious. The Italians had the power to destroy Frank if they wanted to. They had political connections, law enforcement in their pocket, and the muscle to eliminate him. But Frank had prepared for this. He came to the meetings respectful but confident. He didn't act like a subordinate asking for permission. He acted like a businessman proposing a partnership. Frank's pitch was simple. The old model was inefficient and vulnerable. The European supply chain was being disrupted by increased law enforcement scrutiny. The French connection was being busted. The Italian family's monopoly was ending whether they liked it or not. But Frank's Southeast Asian supply chain was secure, efficient, and profitable. Instead of fighting each other, why not work together? Frank offered the Italian families a deal. They could distribute Blue Magic in their territories, New York's other boroughs, New Jersey, other East Coast cities. Frank would give them favorable wholesale prices. Everyone would make more money than before. It was a brilliant negotiation. Frank was essentially offering the Mafia a way to stay relevant in a changing drug market. He was giving them an opportunity to profit from his innovation rather than trying to destroy him for threatening their monopoly. the Italians had to respect it. This wasn't some young hothead challenging them. This was a disciplined businessman who thought several moves ahead. They didn't give Frank their blessing immediately. These things took time, negotiations, trust building. But they also didn't move against him. And in the criminal underworld, sometimes not being attacked is as good as having an alliance. Throughout all of this, Frank maintained his discipline. He never got cocky. He never started acting like he'd already won. He never let success change his behavior. He still lived modestly compared to other gangsters at his level. He still moved quietly through Harlem. He still prioritized his family-run organization over expansion at all costs. And he kept building relationships with the people who mattered, not just other criminals, but community members, small business owners, the people who made Harlem function. Frank understood what Bumpy had understood. Real power in a neighborhood doesn't come just from controlling the drug trade. It comes from being seen as someone who belongs there, who cares about the community, who keeps the worst violence away. Frank would help families with their rent when they were struggling. He'd contribute to community programs. He'd make sure his dealers didn't sell to kids. He'd keep rival gangs from bringing their violence into residential blocks. This wasn't altruism, it was strategy. The community's tacit acceptance made it harder for law enforcement to get cooperation. It made Frank's organization harder to disrupt. It gave him legitimacy. By 1972, Frank Lucas had achieved something remarkable. He'd gone from being Bumpy Johnson's driver to running one of the most sophisticated and profitable drug operations in New York City. He'd done it without starting wars, without attracting excessive law enforcement attention, without making the mistakes that brought down flashier gangsters. He'd built an empire by being everything Bumpy had taught him to be. Patient, disciplined, strategic, and invisible. But there was one problem with being invisible. Eventually, you have to emerge from the shadows to maintain your power. And when Frank Lucas finally started to show himself, it would be both his greatest triumph and the beginning of his downfall. Let's talk about the $100,000 legend. The story goes like this. At Bumpy Johnson's funeral, Frank Lucas walked up to the casket and placed $100,000 in cash inside with Bumpy's body. This dramatic gesture supposedly stunned everyone present. The Italian mobsters, the black gangsters, the community leaders. It showed that Frank had money, that he had guts, and that he had ultimate respect for his mentor. It's a great story. It's been repeated in books, movies, documentaries. The 2007 film American Gangster with Denzel Washington includes a version of it. But here's the truth. It probably didn't happen exactly that way. Frank Lucas himself told different versions of this story over the years. Sometimes he said he put the money in the casket. Sometimes he said he just had the money ready to show his resources. Sometimes the amount changed. Investigators and journalists who've researched Frank's life have found no concrete evidence of the $100,000 in the casket. It seems more likely that this story grew in the telling, becoming a legend that symbolized something true, even if the literal details weren't accurate. So what's the truth behind the legend? The truth is that Frank Lucas did use money and strategic displays of wealth to establish his credibility in Harlem's underworld after Bumpy's death. Remember, Frank had been saving money for 15 years. While other gangsters were spending on luxury, Frank was building capital. By 1968, he had substantial cash reserves, maybe not $100,000 in one moment, but enough to invest in his heroin importing operation, enough to fund his organization, enough to show other gangsters that he was a serious player. And Frank understood the symbolic power of money. In the criminal underworld, especially in an era before digital banking and complex financial instruments, cash was everything. Having cash meant you could fund operations, It meant you could bail people out. It meant you could buy loyalty. It meant you were a real player, not just someone with big talk. So while Frank may not have literally put $100,000 in Bumpy's casket, he did use his saved wealth strategically to establish himself in the power vacuum after Bumpy's death. He'd show up to meetings with resources when others were scrambling. He'd fund operations that other gangsters couldn't afford. He'd demonstrate through actions, not just words, that he had the capital to be a major player. The $100,000 legend is really about something deeper: respect. Frank Lucas understood that respect in the criminal underworld came from several sources. First, respect came from competence. You had to be good at what you did. Frank's blue magic operation was incredibly competent, efficient, profitable, reliable. Second, respect came from loyalty. You had to be someone people could trust, at least within the parameters of the criminal world. Frank built his organization on family loyalty and kept his word in negotiations. Third, respect came from strength. You had to show that you couldn't be pushed around. Frank did this not through violence, but through having resources and options that made him dangerous to cross. Fourth, respect came from wisdom. You had to show you understood the game at a deeper level than just muscle and money. Frank demonstrated this through his strategic thinking and his understanding of market dynamics. And fifth, respect came from honoring those who came before. This is where the $100,000 legend really resonates. Whether he literally put money in Bumpy's casket or not, Frank Lucas made it clear that he revered Bumpy Johnson, that he saw himself as continuing Bumpy's legacy, that he would honor the lessons he'd been taught. This last element was crucial. By positioning himself as Bumpy's spiritual successor, rather than as someone trying to overthrow the old order, Frank gained legitimacy. He wasn't some upstart disrespecting tradition. He was the inheritor of Harlem's greatest gangster's wisdom. Frank's philosophy, learned from Bumpy and refined through his own experience, can be summed up in a few key principles. Stay invisible as long as possible. The longer you operate without attracting attention from law enforcement, rivals, and the media, the longer you can build power and wealth. Discipline beats flash every time. The gangster with the biggest car and the most jewelry is usually the one who gets arrested or killed first. Real power is quiet. Business principles apply to crime. Understand supply chains, market dynamics, profit margins. The best criminals think like businessmen. Family loyalty trumps all. You can't trust everyone. So build your core organization around blood relatives who have skin in the game beyond just money. Respect tradition while innovating. Don't disrespect those who came before, but don't be afraid to find new, better ways of doing things. Violence is expensive and draws attention. Use it only when absolutely necessary. Negotiation and strategy are almost always better tools. The community matters. Operating in a neighborhood means being part of that neighborhood. If people see you as a pure parasite, they'll help law enforcement take you down. These principles allowed Frank Lucas to build an empire that, at its peak in the early 1970s, was bringing in an estimated $1 million per day. That's about $7 million per day in today's money. He'd revolutionized the heroin trade by cutting out middlemen and going directly to Southeast Asian suppliers. He'd built a distribution network that operated with the efficiency of a legitimate business. He'd navigated relationships with Italian Mafia families, rival black gangsters, and the Harlem community with strategic brilliance. He'd done all of this while remaining relatively invisible to law enforcement and the media. Frank Lucas had become everything Bumpy Johnson had taught him to be. a strategic, disciplined, successful criminal operator who understood power at its deepest level. But there was a problem. The very success that Frank had built made invisibility increasingly difficult to maintain. Frank Lucas's empire lasted roughly 5 years at its peak, from about 1970 to 1975. That might not sound like a long time, but in the world of major drug trafficking, it's an eternity. Most dealers at that level get arrested or killed within a year or two. Frank's downfall, when it came, wasn't because he lost a gang war or because he made a stupid mistake. It was because success itself is a kind of visibility. By the mid-1970s, Blue Magic was too successful. Too many people were noticing. Law enforcement couldn't ignore the fact that someone was running a massive heroin operation through Harlem. Federal agencies started investigating. And Frank made one crucial mistake. He broke his own rule about staying invisible. In 1975, Frank attended the Muhammad Ali vs. Joe Frazier Thrilla in Manila fight. And he showed up in style, expensive seats, a fur coat, beautiful women. He was photographed by a DEA agent who happened to be there. That photograph changed everything. Law enforcement finally had a face to attach to all the intelligence they'd been gathering about Blue Magic. They had a target. The investigation intensified. And in 1975, Frank Lucas was arrested along with dozens of his associates in a massive federal drug bust. The empire he'd built so carefully came crashing down because he'd violated the most important lesson Bumpy Johnson had taught him. Stay invisible. Frank was convicted and sentenced to 70 years in prison. But here's where his strategic mind came through one last time. He decided to cooperate with prosecutors. Frank became a federal informant, providing information on corrupt police officers and other criminals. His testimony helped convict dozens of people, including corrupt New York City Police Department officers. In exchange, his sentence was reduced, and he was released after only 5 years. This decision was controversial in Harlem's criminal community. Some saw it as betrayal. Others saw it as smart survival. Frank himself argued that he'd lived by his principles. Family first. He cooperated to protect his family and get back to them. He was released, then arrested again on drug charges in the 1980s, served more time, and was finally released for good in 1991. He lived quietly in New Jersey until his death in 2019 at age 88. So what's the legacy of Frank Lucas? On one level, Frank Lucas was a criminal who profited from heroin, a drug that devastated communities, destroyed families, and contributed to incredible suffering. There's no romanticizing that. The heroin epidemic of the 1970s caused immeasurable harm, and Frank Lucas was part of that system. But from a purely strategic standpoint, Frank Lucas's rise represents something fascinating. The application of business principles and strategic thinking to an illegal enterprise. He identified inefficiencies in a market and found a way to correct them. He built a vertically integrated supply chain when everyone else was accepting the status quo. He understood that discipline and patience were more valuable than flash and aggression. He navigated complex political and criminal relationships with diplomatic skill. Frank Lucas showed that even in the violent, chaotic world of 1960s and 70s drug trafficking, intelligence and strategy could triumph over brute force. The story of Frank Lucas and Bumpy Johnson is ultimately a story about mentorship and legacy. Bumpy Johnson saw potential in a young man from North Carolina and spent 15 years teaching him everything he knew. And Frank Lucas absorbed those lessons so completely that he was able to take what Bumpy had built and transform it into something even more ambitious. When Frank walked into Bumpy's funeral in July 1968, he was grieving his mentor. But he was also prepared to honor Bumpy's legacy in the most meaningful way possible, by applying everything he'd learned. Whether Frank literally placed $100,000 in Bumpy's casket or not, the gesture that story represents is real. Frank Lucas used his resources, his intelligence, and his strategic mind to build something that made everyone in Harlem's underworld take notice. He proved that the quiet man in the back of the room, the one everyone underestimated, could become the most powerful player in the game. He showed that respect and patience are more powerful than violence and noise. He demonstrated that real power isn't about who's the loudest or the flashiest. It's about who's the smartest and the most disciplined. The funeral may have been the starting point, but Frank Lucas's rise was built on 15 years of education from Bumpy Johnson and 5 years of strategic execution that revolutionized the heroin trade in New York City. In the end, Frank Lucas proved that Bumpy Johnson had been right about everything. Stay invisible, stay disciplined, trust family, think strategically, and understand that in the game of power, the tortoise always beats the hare. Bumpy Johnson taught Frank Lucas the streets. Frank Lucas taught the world that respect and patience are more powerful than violence and noise. And that legacy, for better or worse, is what makes Frank Lucas one of the most fascinating figures in American crime history.